The Muscular System, Chapter 6, Part 3. In general, graded muscle contractions can be produced two ways. Number one, by changing the frequency of muscle stimulation, and number two, by changing the number of muscle cells being stimulated at one time. We briefly describe a muscle response to each of these coming up next. So a twitch. A twitch is a single brief contraction. It's not a normal muscle function. Here you can see a single stimuli is delivered and the muscle contracts and relaxes. As a result, the effects of the successive contractions are summed, added together, and the contractions in the muscle group get stronger and smoother. This is a tetanus, the summing of the contractions. In this diagram, stimuli are delivered more frequently, so the muscle does not have time to completely relax. Contraction force increases because effects of the individual twitches are summed. It's summed until the point it is reached where there is no relaxation of the muscle, and the muscle is said to be exhibiting unfused or incomplete tetanus. More complete fusion of the twitches occurs as stimuli are delivered at a still faster rate. When the muscle is stimulated so rapidly that no evidence of relaxation is seen, and the contractions are completely smooth and sustained, the muscle is said to be in fused or complete tetanus or in tetanic contraction. In fused tetanus, a small continuous contraction without any evidence of relaxation results from a very rapid rate of stimulation. Tension on the vertical axis refers to the relative force of muscle contraction. Tetanus produces stronger, more forceful muscle contractions, but its primary role is to produce smooth and prolonged muscle contractions. How forcefully a muscle contracts depends to a large extent on how many of its cells are stimulated. When only a few cells are stimulated, the contraction of the muscle as a whole is slight. When all the motor units are active and the muscle cells are stimulated, the muscle contraction is as strong as it can get. Thus, muscle contractions can be slight or vigorous depending on what work has to be done. This same hand that gently soothes can also deliver a stinging slap. Muscles continue to contract unless they run out of energy. Surprisingly, muscles store very limited supplies of ATP, only a few seconds worth, just enough to get you going. Because ATP is the only energy source that can be used directly to power muscle activity, ATP must be regenerated continuously if contraction is to continue. After this initial time, other pathways must be utilized to produce ATP. One of those ways is by direct phosphorylation of ADP by creatine phosphate. The unique high-energy molecule, creatine phosphate, is found in muscle fibers, but not any other type of muscle cell. As ATP is being depleted, interaction between creatine phosphate and ADP results in transfers of a high-energy phosphate group from the creatine phosphate to the ADP, thus regenerating more ATP in a fraction of a second. Although muscle cells store perhaps 5 times as much creatine phosphate as ATP, the creatine phosphate supplies are also soon exhausted in less than 15 seconds. Next is aerobic respiration. At rest and during light to moderate exercise, some 95% of the ATP used for muscle activity comes from aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration occurs in the mitochondria and involves a series of metabolic pathways that use oxygen. During aerobic respiration, glucose is broken down completely to carbon dioxide and water, and some of the energy released as the bonds are broken is captured in the bonds of ATP molecules. Although aerobic respiration provides a rich ATP harvest, it is fairly slow and requires continuous delivery of oxygen and nutrients to the muscle to keep it going. Here's what it looks like. Anaerobic glycolysis and lactic acid fermentation is another type where we get energy. The initial steps of glucose breakdown occur via a pathway called glycolysis, which does not use oxygen and hence is anaerobic, literally, of course, without oxygen. During glycolysis, glucose is broken down to pyruvic acid and small amounts of energy are captured in ATP bonds. As long as enough oxygen is present, the pyruvic acid then enters the oxygen-requiring anaerobic pathway that occur within the mitochondria to produce more ATP as already described. However, when muscle activity is intense or oxygen and glucose delivery is temporarily inadequate to meet the needs of the working muscles, the sluggish aerobic pathway cannot keep up with the demands of ATP. Under these conditions, the pyruvic acid generated during glycolysis is converted to lactic acid, and the overall process is referred to as anaerobic glycolysis. Anaerobic glycolysis produces only about 5% as much ATP from each glucose molecule as aerobic respiration. However, it is some 2.5 times faster, and it can provide most of the ATP needed for 30 to 40 seconds of strenuous muscle activity. The main shortcomings of aerobic glycolysis are that it uses huge amounts of glucose for a small ATP harvest, and the accumulated lactic acid promotes muscle soreness. If we exercise a muscle strenuously for a long time, muscle fatigue occurs. A muscle is fatigued when it is unable to convert even though it is still being stimulated. Without rest, a working muscle begins to tire and contracts more weakly until it finally ceases reacting and stops contracting. Factors that contribute to muscle fatigue are not known. Suspected causes are imbalances in ions and problems of the neuromuscular junction. However, many agree that the major factor is the oxygen deficit that occurs during prolonged muscular activity. Oxygen deficit is not a total lack of oxygen. Rather, it happens when a person is not able to take in oxygen fast enough to keep the muscles supplied with all the oxygen they need when they are working vigorously. Obviously, then, the work that a muscle can do and how long it can work without becoming fatigued depends on how good its blood supply is. When muscles lack oxygen, lactic acid begins to accumulate in the muscle via the anaerobic pathway described earlier, and we can recognize this event by the burning sensation we experience. In addition, the muscle's ATP supply starts to run low, and ionic imbalances tend to occur. Together, these factors cause the muscle to contract less and less effectively, and finally to stop contracting altogether. True muscle fatigue, in which the muscle quits entirely, rarely occurs in most of us because we feel fatigue long before it happens, and we simply slow down or stop our activity. It does happen commonly in marathon runners. Many of them have literally collapsed when their muscles became fatigued and could no longer work. Oxygen deficit, which always occurs to some extent during vigorous muscle activity, must be paid back, whether fatigue occurs or not. During the recovery period after activity, the individual breathes rapidly and deeply. This continues until the muscle has received the amount of oxygen needed to get rid of the accumulated lactic acid and make ATP and creatine phosphate reserves. Isotonic contractions are familiar to most of us. In isotonic contractions, the myofilaments are successful in their sliding movements. The muscle shortens and movement occurs. Bending the knee, rotating the arms, and smiling are all examples of isotonic contractions. Contractions in which the muscles do not shorten are called isometric contractions. In isometric contractions, the myosin myofilaments are spinning their wheels, and the tension in the muscle keeps increasing. They are trying to slide, but the muscle is pitted against some more or less immovable object. For example, muscles are contracting isometrically when you try to lift a 400-pound dresser all by yourself. When you straighten a bent elbow, the tricep muscle is contracting isotonically. But when you push against a wall with a bent elbow, the wall doesn't move, and the tricep muscles, which cannot shorten to straighten the elbows, are contracting isometrically. One aspect of skeletal muscle activity cannot be consciously controlled. Even when a muscle is voluntarily relaxed, some of its fibers are contracting, first one group, then another. Their contraction is not visible, but as a result of it, the muscle remains firm, healthy, and constantly ready for action. This state of continuous partial contraction is called muscle tone. Muscle tone is the result of different motor units, which are scattered throughout the muscle, being stimulated by the nervous system in a systematic way. The amount of work a muscle does is reflected in changes in the muscle itself. Muscle inactivity, which could be due to the loss of nerve supply, immobilization, or whatever the cause, always leads to muscle weakness and wasting. Muscles are no exception to the saying, use it or lose it. Conversely, regular exercise, increasing muscle size, strength, and endurance. However, not all types of exercise produce these effects. In fact, there are important differences in the benefits of exercise. Aerobic or endurance types of exercise, such as participating in an aerobic class, jogging, or biking, result in stronger, more flexible muscles with a greater resistance to fatigue. However, aerobic exercise benefits much more than just the skeletal muscles. It makes overall body metabolism more efficient, improves digestion, enhances neuromuscular coordination, and makes the skeleton stronger. The heart enlarges so that more blood is pumped out with each beat. Fat deposits are cleared from the blood vessels, and the lungs become more efficient in gas exchange. These benefits may be permanent or temporary depending on how often or how vigorously a person exercises. Aerobic exercise does not cause the muscles to increase much in size, even though the exercise may go on for hours. The bulging muscles of a bodybuilder or professional weightlifter result mainly from resistant or isometric exercise, which pit the muscle against some immovable object or nearly immovable. Resistance exercise requires very little time and little or no special equipment. A few minutes every day is usually sufficient. You can push against a wall, or you can strongly contract buttock muscles even while standing in the line at the grocery store. The key is forcing the muscles to contract with as much force as possible. The increased muscle size and strength that result are due mainly to the enlargement of individual muscle cells rather than to an increase in their number. The amount of connective tissue that reinforces the muscle will also increase. Here we can see the effects of aerobic training versus strength training. So what are our key points here? Number one, what are the three energy sources for skeletal muscle contraction? What is the immediate source of energy for muscle contraction? And let's try this one on for size. Gary is trying with all his might to pull a tree stump out of the ground. It doesn't bulge. What type of contractions are his muscles undergoing? What is meant by the term oxygen deficit? And to develop big, beautiful skeletal muscles, you should focus on what type of exercise, aerobic or resistance exercise. They're in lectures number 3.